And so please be seated. And so may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Sometimes in life we find ourselves in a place that the prophet Joel describes, and I want to focus on the reading from Joel this morning, where Joel says, "A day of darkness, gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like blackness spread upon the mountains, a great and powerful army comes." Sometimes we can find ourselves in a place like that, a place where it feels dark, gloomy. Everything feels almost like a thick cloud has spread over us on the inside. Anyone who has struggled with depression, with grief, or with any internal struggle knows exactly what I'm talking about. That darkness, that gloom, that feeling like the thick cloud has descended. And how thick and dark sometimes that cloud can feel. But it's interesting that Joel says, even in this place, he actually uses those words, even in this place, God says, return to me. You see, I think so often we feel like somehow when I've got it back together, then I'll go back to God. Somehow when I've made it all right in my life, then I'll go back to church. God says no. Even when you are in that place where you feel like that thick cloud is so thick that you cannot feel like you can do anything, even in that place, God says, return to me. You see, God doesn't ask us to return with joy. God doesn't ask us to return with gladness. God doesn't even in this passage say, return with hope. God simply says, return with your heart. Isn't that interesting? Return with your heart as it is. Return with your weeping. Return with your mourning. The passage there actually says, let your hearts be rent apart. If you rent a garment, what do? You literally take two pieces and you tear. How many of you have ever tried to tear fabric? I know some of you have. In fact, we got a number of people here who probably are pretty experts at tearing fabric. I know when I've tried to tear fabric, it doesn't tear easily, right? Especially if you're tearing it at the wrong angle, right? And if you don't know about fabric, you most invariably are tearing it at the wrong angle. Louise told me about this, all right? But when you tear fabric, it takes some real strength. You've actually got to pull, and you've literally got to rip that fabric, right? That's what Joel is saying. Let your hearts be rent apart. Literally, come back to God with hearts that have been ripped, hearts that have been torn. And if your hearts have become so numb that they won't break, the prophet Joel says, then you rend them apart. You tear them apart. But Joel says, let our hearts be broken. Let us sometimes surrender to the pain that is within or the pain that is in our world. And you see, that's the place that Lent begins. Lent begins by acknowledging not just the suffering of God, that we're going to walk with God in these next 40 days of temptation, of anxiety, of rejection and suffering. Lent is not just also about entering into the suffering of the world, of which we know there is a lot of in this world. But Lent is about first and foremost being prepared to go into your own place of pain and suffering. Because you cannot accompany somebody else in their journey of pain and suffering if you are not in touch with your own pain and suffering, right? And if I can't walk with my neighbor in pain and suffering because I'm not in touch with my own pain and suffering, how then can I walk alongside God in God's pain and suffering? Can you see that? It starts first with acknowledging and getting in touch with our own places where we bleed and where we feel like our hearts have been ripped open. If there is one thing that we are all good at in this life, it's pretending that everything is okay. Would you agree with me?
Amen.
Because for most of us, we've become so good at this because we've had a whole lifetime of practice, right? Our whole lifetime has been a
Fine.
Fine. Huh? Good, thank you. Inside, we may be weeping, but we've had a lifetime of pretending that everything is okay. And yet, I as a priest, because I know you well enough and I know each of your stories, know that underneath that fine or that smile is a lot of grief, is a lot of struggle, and a lot of pain. And those of you who know me well enough, and that's increasingly more and more of you, know that under my fine and smile, there is equally a lot of pain and grief and struggle. What Ash Wednesday does is liturgically it makes space for us to say, returning to God does not mean returning when I have my life all together and put back together. It doesn't mean returning only when I'm in a place of joy, happiness, and rejoicing. It means I return to God from the place where I am really at this moment and this place in time. I return from my heart and from where my heart really is. And I allow the journey to begin from that place. And so this Lenten journey, I really encourage us all to really begin from where our hearts really are this Lent. Not from where you want them to be, not from where you pretend them to be, but from where they really are. And as we offer to God our hearts, which very often have places of weeping, tearing, grief, or anxiety, we offer them to God this day, this Ash Wednesday. St. Paul reminds us that there is no shame in pain. I want you to think about that. There is no shame in pain. Paul says we as servants of God have been through afflictions. We have been through hardships. We've been through beatings, imprisonment, riots, sleepless nights. He goes on and he lists them all. So if there's any myth about the one who was closest to God having it all together, Paul blows that in this passage. He says we as disciples have been through all of these things. We know the darkness in both our bodies and in our hearts. But in all these things, he says, we offer them to God. We offer our hearts and ourselves as they truly are to God this Ash Wednesday. Each one of you, as you came into the service, was given a piece of paper and a pencil. And for those of you that may not have picked up a piece of paper or pencil, as soon as I finish, I'm going to go and fetch you one. And what I want you to do, we're going to have a moment's silence after the sermon. Thank you, Jim. I want you to write down what has torn your heart. Where is your heart bleeding right now? What is rending your heart apart? All right? Sometimes it's a relationship with a child. Sometimes it's a circumstance we're going through. Sometimes it's a grief that we're grieving. Sometimes we don't even know what to say. All we know is we're bleeding on the inside and we don't know how to express it. Take that piece of paper and that pencil and write down what is rending your heart at this given moment. And write it down as a prayer to God. And then I'm going to ask each one of us to come up and in the baptismal font, which remember is the place where our true identity is forged in our baptisms, right? It is the place of, in some ways, new life in God. You'll find little clothespins. And they're black. They're not gold, they're not red, they're not white, they're black. Because that's sometimes how it feels on the inside. And I want you to take one of those clothespins and the little paper that you've written, don't put your name on it, and don't put your name on it. God knows what you've written. And I want you to pin it to the cross. Because I want us today to offer our hearts to God as they really are. Let our pain this Lent join with the pain of Christ and the pain of this world. Let us unite in some ways our own inner brokenness with God's brokenness and with the brokenness of our world. Because sometimes we have to remember that we can only know the fullness of life when we've allowed ourselves to grieve the places where we've lost life. We can only really know light when we have really entered into darkness. There is no resurrection of Easter without the Good Friday death. And so today, each one of us, let us claim that sometimes on the inside, There are places in us that can feel as dead as the ashes with which we will be anointed today. There are places in us that for whatever reason have been burnt out, have died, that sometimes feel like they are beyond life. Today, can we, as we've placed that piece of paper on the cross, then I invite you to come straight away and to kneel here at the altar and allow yourself to be anointed with dry, dead ash that in some ways may mirror some places in your hearts. But as we offer the dry ash to God, who knows what God can do with dry ash? For who knew what God could do with death? Who knew what God could do with dry bones? Who knows what God can do with a broken heart? In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.